Bonjour mes amis, bienvenue ici 10 .NET API review, and if my French was correct on that one, I will be really impressed. We have a handful of red issues, including an unusual one in that I don't remember the last time we talked about one, which is from WPF, which is where we will start today. So we have open folder dialog WPF issue 7689er. Who wants to talk about this?
Yeah, so I would go forward with this issue. And hello, I'm Dipesh, and I'm from WPF team. And today here with us is Jan. He drafted this API proposal for open folder dialog and has thoroughly investigated different flags and properties that are included here. So a great thanks to Jan and his contributions. Okay, so moving ahead, regarding the background for this proposal. So as of now, developers using WPF do not have a proper way of selecting folder using dialogs. Okay, so either they have to use reference when forms, or they have to use a third-party library for this purpose. And since this is a very common functionality for applications, we want to introduce a WPF native API for picking folders. Okay, so that was basically regarding the background and motivation of this proposal. Moving ahead, as you can see, so since this is a large change, so I will divide it into 4 different categories. Okay, so first is that we are introducing a new abstract base class, common item dialog, and a sealed public class open folder dialog, which is the class that the developers will be using for folder selection. Okay, so these are 2 new classes addition here. as you can see. Now, moving ahead to common item dialog. So it acts as a new base class for file dialog and open folder dialog. So what we are doing is we like file dialog has a lot of had a lot of public members which apply both to folder dialog as well as file dialog. So what we tried here was like we moved the public members up the inheritance chain from file dialog to common item dialog, and we created a new class open folder dialog from there. So as to avoid duplication of code. Okay. And the second part of this of this proposal is that we have added new members. So if you scroll up a little, and you'll see the section with new members. So these are basically flags and interface calls that are already present in native uh, that uh, it is present as a capability in native applications. When we show file dialogs using iFile dialog interfaces. So we have added a bunch of properties to allow users to modify these flags and customize their dialogues as per their needs. Okay, so moving ahead, if you scroll down a little bit, so including the properties mentioned above, we have added two more properties, an open file dialog and save file dialog. So these dialogues are also, these properties are also related to flags that can be set in native control. And the last part of the fix is that just scroll a little up to file dialog, and you'll see that we have removed some members like options and hook proc. So earlier what used to happen was like WPF supported both legacy dialogues and Vista dialogues. So with this proposal, we want to remove the support for legacy dialogues as well. So this is the basic summarization of the API.
Can I just to try and make sure I understood correctly? So there's already a common dialog, a file dialog, an open file dialog, and a save file dialog. This is proposing adding a new intermediary base type common item dialog that will sit underneath open file dialog between it and underneath file dialog. Also adding a new open folder dialog that will then also derive from that new common base type. And then you're lifting things that were on open file dialog into the common, or that were on file dialog into the common item dialog.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So actually there were to implement open folder dialogs, there were other approaches like inheriting from common dialog itself, but that would require duplication of a lot of APIs and public members. So rather than that, we decided to split the inheritance chain and move members up the chain.
What else derives from common dialog today?
As of now, no, nothing else derives from common dialog. But
we expect other stuff too.
Yeah, there are like in WinForms as of now there is font dialog and color picker dialogs which derive from common dialog. So that's why we want to keep common dialog like as close to the native.
Are there going to be other things besides file and folder that derive from common item dialog?
No, as of now, we don't see anything that will be derived from here. Jan, if you want, do you agree with this thing, right?
Yeah, that is correct. The problem with the common dialog is that it was intended for other dialogues than the file dialogues, and there is existing code from customers that use this base class for dialogues unrelated to the files. So I couldn't really, I could, but I would have polluted all their, dialogues with unrelated members if we just lifted everything up to the common dialog directly.
How close in structure is this proposal to what WinForms already has?
So it's not actually close to what WinForms has. So WinForms had folder browser dialog like from way back, and so they used the legacy SH folder browser API. So due to which they inherited from common dialog, and later when we started using the similar dialog both for both folder and file dialogs, so there was a lot of duplication of members there as well.
I see. So
So
this is trying to avoid duplication that Windows Forms already has.
yeah, because they already had it in place, and to like accommodate the new changes, they had to duplicate the rest of the APIs.
I see. So WinForms basically has everything deriving from common dialog, and because common dialog is too broad, things can't be shared, so they're duplicated on each of open folder, open file, etc.
Yeah.
And this is introducing the intermediary to try and be the base type for file and folder.
Yeah.
How come can you scroll down a little bit, Jeremy? There were some things that looked like they were duplicated but weren't pushed down, like multi-select. How come that still shows up on both?
So for that, actually multi-select is not supported in save file dialog. So it doesn't make sense to put it in file dialog or common item dialog. That's why it's duplicated here.
I see. But everything else that was moved up makes sense for save file.
Yeah. So
even things like file names that takes the string array.
Yeah, I was just coming to that, and so there is a proposed design where we will have internal properties and common item dialog, and we can have file name and folder names separately for file dialog and open folder dialog, but it has its own like disadvantages. So Jan has done a investigation on that, and I think he will be better to take this question.
Sorry, Dipesh, I don't think that was the question. The question was, why would we have an array of file names on the save dialog if it doesn't support multiple file names?
Right.
Okay, sorry.
And that reason is backwards compatibility. The file names array contains single file, if that is the case.
Sorry, I didn't understand the backward compatibility. Can you scroll up just a tad, Jeremy?
So if we
today the multi-name one exists on.
So yes.
Oh, it's already on save file dialog.
Yeah.
Yes.
I see.
Speaking of backward compatibility, why was options removed? This is just not used.
I think so. One thing that Dipesh didn't say that the file dialog has internal abstract members, so there is no classes of customers that can derive from these, and that's why I was confident removing protected members. The reason they were removed was because they, in the existing code, this was sort of storage for all sort of flags, including the XP dialogues, the Vista dialogues, and internal WPF flags, and they were not always agreeing with each other. So as a part of removing the support for the legacy dialogues, and because no one can derive from this class, the options was removed. It was made strongly typed for the Vista dialogues, and the WPF flags are separate properties.
So no one derives from like the existing file dialog class. It's just not a thing people do.
No, you cannot do that because they are abstract internal members.
Oh, I see. Wait.
They're just not
Is it
showing
not
up
like
here.
protected internal? I see.
Sorry.
What was the question?
Oh, I was just thinking, like, I know that like protected internal is like an or instead of an and, but I assume with like abstract internal, it's actually impossible to derive from it outside the assembly.
Yes, correct. The internal members are not in this div.
I see.
Assuming
So
that
the
they showed
stuff
up in
that's-
the ref. And then if not, then I don't know what the runtime does. I think explode.
So the things that are actually net new, what are those? Like not the
Sorry.
stuff that's being moved down, but the new types and brand new members being introduced. Which ones
Yep.
are those?
So just scroll up and you will see there's a section of new members there. So these are basically flags that we can set for iFile dialog interface to provide different capabilities. And like on the means at the end of the line, you will see the flag names or the iFile dialog. It means interface methods that correspond to this property. So, do you want me to explain these properties as well?
Sure.
Okay, so add to recent is basically like when we open a dialog on the left side, we see a pane of custom places, right? And there we can like in the recent tab, do we want to add the folder or not? Means that's that flag does. Means what if we want to add there means something or not. That is controlled by add to recent. Allow read-only items will display. Means switching this flag will display read-only items or not. Means depending on what's the values that. For show hidden displays the hidden files by default. Now we have root directory, which restricts users from navigating above a particular level. And there's a default directory, which is the directory which the dialog will show the first time it will be shown. Means it will be the address in the toolbar the first time the dialog is shown.
If root directory is basically a sandbox limit, well, how do you clear it? Is that the empty string?
I haven't gone into the implementation detail yet, but
I'm just asking, should this be string? You guys might not have nullable annotations enabled, so all your question marks are real. Yeah, so if you don't have nullable reference annotations, then this is fine. I was asking, should it be string question mark? But...
Okay, as of now, we don't have that nullable annotations yet.
Can you just describe allow read-only items and client GUID one more time?
Okay, so allow read-only items. Just a second. So basically, in like when you open the properties of a file, you will see there are attributes there, read-only attribute and those things. So
right.
Allow read-only items checks for that attribute selection.
Sure, but it said it's defaulting to false. Does that mean today, if I open the open file dialog, I don't see read-only items?
So I think, sorry, I put that default values recently. I believe the default might be different for save dialog and for open dialog, according to the documentation.
Okay.
So the native API doc says do not return read-only items. That is the default value for save dialog.
Okay. I can understand it being the default for save. I'd be concerned if it was the default for open.
Yeah.
Especially because that
I
would presumably, as a new member, that would presumably break open, like current experiences.
Right. Also, to your previous questions about WinForms members, so I just checked. The WinForms has the add to recent one. It has the client GUID, and it has the first show hidden. But in WinForms, that one is called show hidden files. I'm happy to call it the same as is in WinForms.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it'd be great to make things as similar as possible. If there are members that WinForms doesn't have, I think you didn't use it. It doesn't have allowed read only. It doesn't have group directory, I guess. It'd be good to understand why it doesn't need them, but this does.
Well, yeah, I guess it's what you let developers to do, right? And was kind of going to, if the native API has that flag, I would just make it available to developers.
Sure, as long as we come up with, good behaviors around it, and there's no penalty, and other complications. Sometimes exposing more stuff actually adds complexity.
Right.
So it needs to be worth its weight. WinForms also exposes the client GUID. It calls it client GUID, and it's a GUID. It's a nullable GUID.
Yes.
Okay.
So the current file dialog has internal abstracts. Is the new common item dialog actually extensible, or is it also limited to only WPF can derive from it?
That is a good question. I believe I have preserved the internal abstract members, but let me double check.
If there are internal abstracts, then we should call this constructor private protected.
Right.
Or internal.
Okay. I would think that whether we want to have the dialogues extensible or not, is that something that should go through the API review?
Yes, and we should start with not. Especially if they're not already extensible, making them extensible is a big deal. Requires a whole lot more engineering work. It's not just as simple as changing something from internal to protected. So we need to be really sure that's something we want to bite off, and then we need to fully test all extensibility aspects of it by doing that. So the easiest answer is, unless there's a really strong scenario motivating it, don't do it.
Okay, so the common item dialog has what used to be internal members, and I changed them to private protected, which means people cannot derive from that still.
Right, but I'm just changing it in the proposal to change the constructor to show that it's private protected, which means that we don't have to talk about the things that aren't shown outside.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
And if that doesn't compile, then change it to internal, and then internal plus abstract equals private protected.
Yeah, I just follow the pattern in the existing classes that just use protected.
Yep.
So I don't have an issue with doing that.
Back to some of the new members. So if I say allow read-only items true on the save file dialog, what happens? It just allows me to overwrite something that's read-only. Is that?
Yes, I believe that is the case.
I presume it just changes whether or not it shows them in the dialog. You can still type the file name and submit through it anyway.
This flag just controls what will be shown in the dialog. So.
For the type name itself, is item a term we use elsewhere to refer to files or folders? Like, is that the common terminology for the two of those things together?
The dialog is called common item dialog in the documentation.
In what documentation?
In the native API. I can send a link to that. But I'm open to better names. If you have suggestions.
I don't think it's bad. I just want to make sure we're not trying to introduce new terminology.
I send a link to the docs.
Actually, once the visitor dialogs were introduced, after that we have started referring this as common item dialogs. So common item dialogs to include the open, save, and folder dialog.
The reason for that is that the dialogs supports non-file items, right? That just you can do shell items, and I'm hoping in the future we would be able to add support for shell items.
So just looking at the link you sent, Jan, I see it talking about file dialogs.
Yeah.
Is that inclusive of folder dialogs?
Yes, the folder dialog, and so in the native part there is actually not a separate class for the folder dialog. The folder dialog is just a flag on the file dialog that's saying this is folders only.
Should we be representing it similarly in WPF? I'm trying to understand what our thinking is for when we're trying to maintain similarity with the native APIs, with the Win32 APIs, and when we're not.
Okay, the reason for splitting them in the managed code was that several of the members on the file dialogs become non-functioning for the folder dialogs. Some of them start throwing, and some of them just do nothing. And so there seemed to have been consensus in the community that people don't like that. So we created a sort of an extra abstraction that doesn't have the members that don't work or are throwing for the folder dialog.
So everything that shows up then on open folder is fully functional, and everything that shows up on open file is fully functional?
Correct.
Right. I just added the link to a comment where there's a distinction between what properties are function for folders and what not. Like what properties from the file dialog function for folders and what don't.
I see in chat.
If you just scroll down, the extension methods and filter index, these things don't work for folders.
Okay. The other new APIs are the ones in green at the bottom. Those are all net new.
That is new, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does create test file mean?
That lets
Sorry,
you
continue.
tell that you ask the dialog to not try to create a file and make sure that the user has a rights to create a file where they chose in the dialog. So if you want to skip that test, then you set that flag. You create that flag. Sorry.
So with the default save file dialog, every time you double click through a folder, it creates and deletes a file?
Yes, correct. That's my understanding. But that is the native API. WPF does not do that.
But save file dialog already exists. So without this member, you're saying that's already the case.
Yes,
This member allows you to disable that behavior by setting it to false.
correct.
Because yeah, I mean, I don't know that the name is all that obvious to me. I wonder if it should be sort of inverse described of like, skip, like a skip test file creation. But
So actually the flag itself is named as no test file create. So we can,
Yeah, and it might be the right thing to name it, but there's a distinction to be made between the Win32 APIs that we don't expect people to be looking at and that aren't named in a scheme that matches with .NET naming, and creating a name that will be looked at by .NET developers using .NET and that does match the scheme. So while it's nice to have similarities for search purposes and for documentation purposes, we don't have to maintain parity.
The reason this is inverted is just following the add to recent property, which is the same case. The flag is actually negative, it's don't add to recent. And in the existing code, the managed property is add to recent.
right. So
Yeah, I like the positive naming, certainly.
Yeah.
yeah, I guess my problem here is on the dialog create test file feels like it should be the name of a method, and it should be. I mean, you could say the same with add to recent, but you know, looking at it, it's like
prompt.
yeah. I also
These
don't
are
know
all
what,
things that are.
like I said, I also don't know what create prompt does, but
But I mean, all of these sound like their methods: create prompt, overwrite prompt,
yep.
show read only. They're all verbs.
Yeah, I mean, show read only feels like the kind of thing that I could see next to a slider of on off. Create prompt that feels less good in that case, but create prompt is the member that already exists. So
Right. I'm just suggesting that I don't feel terrible about creating, you know, if there's already a create A and an overwrite B, adding a create C doesn't feel terrible.
fair enough.
I mean, on the whole, the seems fine. There shouldn't be any breaking change concerns because the only members that are being removed are protected members that were inaccessible anyway because no one could derive from these types. So the only break there is private reflection, which we don't generally consider to be a break. And everything else is just being moved down rather than removed. There's only a few new members for the most part, as long as we, wherever possible, name them the same as what WinForms does.
Yeah, I fixed that.
Common item dialog, I guess, is a reasonable name if that's a known concept, even if it differs slightly in the Win32 world.
It does have the advantage of it literally matches the title of the concept docs page from WinUI.
Right. Yeah, that on the whole seems okay to me.
All right, so right, these types aren't derivable, so I don't need to care what dispatch is going to do. Right, so the runtime handles. It definitely handles non-virtuals, like non-virtual base slots, moving down, and nothing that's moving down is virtual, which means I don't have to remember what it does for moving a virtual down. And the overrides would get jumped through, but it doesn't matter because these types aren't derivable outside the assembly.
Right.
So, yeah, so I don't. So this question had come up in YouTube chat at the beginning of asking, is it generally safe to insert a class in the hierarchy? And yes, unless you do things like move public virtual down and add public new virtual, in which case you've interestingly changed what the world does. But
extensibility is hard.
Yeah, but since none of these are virtual and the types aren't derivable outside the type or outside the assembly, I don't think we've done anything that will upset the universe. Yeah, does WinForms have the root directory sandbox concept?
I will have to check that. I haven't seen the property called root directory in WinForms, but I know the legacy XP dialog does have a concept of a sandbox, and
because this is just back to Steve's point of if we've already introduced the name, if we've already introduced a member name in .NET for this purpose, unless it now has a different purpose in WPF, we should align with the same name.
Yep.
So we do have a root folder there, but that comes from the legacy dialog. So the one that like before iPad dialog interface, we had SH browser API, right? So means basically the old folder browser dialog that used to have a root folder there.
Okay, so it's called the same then.
I see folder browser dialog in Windows Forms has a root folder property.
Okay.
Is this the same thing?
That is most likely the same thing. The reason for calling it directory is because we already have other properties called directory, initial directory. We already have.
I see. That's fair. Windows Forms uses a special environment.special folder rather than an arbitrary string. Do you happen to know why?
Possibly because you can set it to something else than a folder, like this PC or something like that.
Right, but it also means you can't send it to an arbitrary folder.
Right.
Just to add, set navigation root is never called in WinForms, so root folder may be for a different purpose in WinForms altogether.
No, that is because they use the legacy API, and that has different. They don't use the apply dialog in the legacy.
Yeah, they pass it to sh get special folder location.
Yeah.
And then they pass it to something else. What are they passing it to? The browse info w, part of a struct browse info w. which is then passed to sh browse for folder. So it's fed in through that way.
Yeah, so WinForms has what I think here is called default directory, and they call initial directory.
No, we have
These are
initial
actually
directory.
different.
Okay, what's the difference between initial and default?
The difference is whether you have already opened dialog before and you have a sort of most recent selected folder or file. The default directory, I believe, applies when there is no previous recent location to start the dialog in, and the initial directory forces the dialog to be in a specific directory the developer asks for.
Okay. Yeah, so Steve, are you good with root directory being called directory since it doesn't take a special folder? So different suffix showing it takes a different value.
Sorry, am I fine with it being called root directory? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, instead of root folder, which is what
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. And because directory is used elsewhere on the API, I think that's reasonable.
Right. Well, because WinForms does have directory used in multiple places, but then calls it root folder, probably because it was based on special folder.
Right.
And okay, all the moved stuff I'll ignore. Things I don't like about. Alright, so what I've noted is I fixed the proposal because it said it was introducing a type but didn't say that file dialog was actually being changed to derive from it.
Right.
And we renamed force show hidden to show hidden files. I changed the constructor to be private protected so that we didn't have to think too hard about things. And that seems to be the only things we changed from the initial proposal, unless anybody recalls something I didn't write down.
No, I was changing it in the issue as we talked.
Oh, please don't ever do that.
Okay.
Alright.
Just wanted to ask something. Like moving internal abstract members, like if we are moving internal abstract members to comma and item dialog, so does that mean like people will be able to derive from file dialog again? Means since it is public and
yeah, you should go ahead and explicitly change file dialog to have a private protected constructor. Internal implementation details should not change whether or not someone can derive from it.
Now, presumably you would want to have the same changes for the open file dialog and save file dialog as well?
They're sealed. So,
Okay.
and they need public constructors, so nobody can create them.
Okay. My bad.
All right. I don't see anything else in YouTube chat, and no one else is bringing anything else up, so approved.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That one. All right. Next up on the agenda Emo sent out was .NET Runtime 7.9.841. Maybe CA 1043 should be deleted.
Could we actually skip to the last one, Jeremy, just because I need to leave in a few minutes, and I told Tarek that I would act on his behalf.
Get elapsed time?
Yeah.
Okay. So 8.4.9.4.5, add get elapsed time long.
So on Stopwatch, we have two get elapsed time methods. We have one that takes a starting timestamp and an ending timestamp, and we have one that just takes the starting timestamp and internally it creates an ending timestamp based on the current time and basically delegates to the other one, because it's a very common pattern. When we created time provider, we only added one of them. We didn't add the second one, and this is proposing adding the second one because it is a common pattern. So somewhere, you get a timestamp, and then later on, when you want to know how much time has elapsed, you call get elapsed time, passing in that starting timestamp, and this implicitly creates the second one to diff.
Right. So that's from a reference datum to now.
Right. Yeah. I love that you said datum.
We were talking about airplanes in chat. I'm thinking of very technical words now.
So basically, this is just mirroring what Stopwatch already has in terms of helpers.
Any objections, concerns, criticism? Other than the way that I like updating issues. Boom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alright, now back to maybe CA 1043 should be deleted. So
So this is
go ahead, Booyah.
So this is an analyzer for detecting if an indexer in a type uses an index type other than int, long, string, or object, or enum, and runs it if it's not the type, desired type. In general, it just runs for any type except those types, and it's the rule looks like I need to cover more scenarios, or maybe we just want to delete the rule completely.
Right, so
the rule is disabled for now.
So what Framework Design Guideline says, and the only thing I did in this version was add range and index to the list, is unless you're a dictionary, then indexers should only use numbers, strings, or our indexy thingies, or any num. So perhaps what the rule is missing is the caveat of except on dictionary-like types.
Yes. And I think it's not that straightforward to determine that. I mean, we might cover some cases, but I'm not sure if it should just add to consider or add the exceptions for dictionaries, but it might be not that straightforward to determine that. or we can just delete the rule.
Yeah, so I mean,
Also, we might want to remove the object from the list because it also doesn't make much sense.
right, so I don't know why the rule accepts object. That may have been the way that they were encoding dictionariness when it was originally written.
Maybe.
Yeah, because I mean the gist of the rule is if you're taking something other than those things, you're probably doing something other than indexing, unless you're a dictionary and it's a generic key. And where by generic I don't mean necessarily of T. And that you're probably abusing syntax instead of thinking about your API. And it's probably still a correct rule in spirit. I just don't know that the actual analyzer is detecting the things that it should. Which means I don't personally have an answer of should we fix it or delete it. Does anybody else?
I'm not sure I quite understand why the rule is there in the first place. And also, this is complaining about enums too. I thought enums were on like the list of allowed things that you just showed.
Enums are on the list.
It's to check the underlying type of the enum, and if it's listed in the type, then it will be okay.
Yeah, I mean, if it's taking object that doesn't seem to match what our current guidelines would say, I don't know why it says multiple parameters are okay. I mean, probably this rule just stemmed back in FX cop, and it was probably just hard to write it. If I'm, being honest, because I think, on something like a matrix, a multi-dimensional indexer makes sense, but you'd still be keying it by position, because you're, it makes sense in context. But it should still be, numbers there. So I don't know. It sounds like the rule isn't actually matching the guideline that it corresponds to, or sorry, the analyzer isn't matching the guide, or the analyzer's implementation does not correctly reflect what the guideline says, and we should make it match. Unless I'm missing something.
What does the guideline actually say? Because is that going to actually address this person's concern?
Avoid indexers with parameter types other than int32, int64, string, range, index, or an enum, except on dictionary-like types.
So is the argument that this person's scenario falls under dictionary-like types, and dictionary-like types is very broad?
I mean, their starting issue is that the implementation of the analyzer.
Look at the second paragraph. They're talking about their scenario of cards and card suits.
Right. So you said it already doesn't flag on indexers that take multiple values, right? And those are enums, so it shouldn't be flagged to begin with. Card value and suit.
Card is a struct.
The
first one on the
card
list
is a struct that contains the card value and suit.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, this card one would be flagged.
what's the reason for the rule? Like, I'm reading the docs and it's like you shouldn't do it, but I don't quite understand why you shouldn't do it.
I mean, I think it just is a general. If you're using a type other than one of these types, ask yourself: are you abusing syntax or are you making proper API?
I mean, I think I can squint and say this is a dictionary-like type in this example, but that just means that everything is allowed, because everything is a dictionary-like type is anything that maps one thing to something else, which is exactly what a single parameter indexer does in pretty much all cases.
Yeah, I was gonna, think of something like Jeremy K's path normalization thing, but you shouldn't do path normalizer of the path you want, producing the path that is the normalized version. But that would take string, so it would pass the rule.
But trying to think of something that would not be allowed with a very generous definition of dictionary-like.
Right, like literally if you were doing math on the argument and not looking anything up, like, I don't know, you had some sort of like math.float is an object that has an indexer, like, or math.sign, like, or something weird. But like, I don't see how an analyzer would ever detect that reliably.
Right. I mean, I think maybe the answer is the analyzer shouldn't exist, and this is a, Scout's honor. This is doing something that makes sense.
That's fair. Because I can think of a bunch of bad scenarios like the path normalization, etc. That's all really down to what does the method do instead of what signature does it have. Yeah, so like I said, the only thing I did in V3 was I added range and index to the guideline. If we really wanted to know the history here, we'd need to ask Christoph. But I think that there's maybe a difference between the guideline, which is don't abuse syntax, which is trying to say don't abuse syntax, and the implementation of the analyzer rule, which is it needs to figure out if you're abusing syntax, and that would require looking at the implementation, not at the signature.
Yeah.
Yep.
And even looking at implementation is probably insufficient.
But the path normalizer, it should be a verb called normalize, not just a square brace. And it's like, well,
right.
That's why? Because it's not a dictionary.
Right. I think the answer is the spirit of the rule is valid. Like you said, it's don't abuse syntax. It should be indexing into the thing. It should be looking something up in the implementation. It should be a dictionary-like thing, but we can't validate that appropriately with an analyzer, so the analyzer should be nuked. Or, I don't know if it's already off by default, but it should be off by default if we want to keep it such that someone can still opt into it if they like what it was previously validating.
It is all off by default.
Okay.
Yeah, my gut is like most people who add indexers of a type that's not like a string or an int probably are doing a lookup, so it probably has a higher false positive rate than actually finding stuff. Maybe I trust people too much.
Yeah, I mean, if it's off by default, then doing things like take object out. It's also possible that this used to say object here and that I removed it because after confirming with Christoph that it was legacy from pre-generics days. That, you know, we could leave it and update the types list, and if it's off by default, the people who turn it on
It's
maybe find it useful.
already excluding range and index.
Right, just because we didn't update the rule since we added those types. So
The rule is already excluding those, but not the dictionary like types. That scenario is not covered and doesn't look like efficiently can be covered.
right, so I mean, my point is, if the rule is already off by default, then this may be a rule that people are turning on of don't add indexers unless you think hard about it. But then that these, yeah. So maybe that just goes back to just delete the rule. I'm trying hard to find the person who, I mean, somebody obviously turned it on because they complained about it. I'm just trying to understand, is there somebody who would think that the rule itself is providing value, or that we could write it in such a way that it does provide value? And I don't think we can. And the fact that the guideline is an avoid instead of a do not is really already bringing up this notion of like, okay, you could have a, you know, something like the card struct, which is your card could have been represented as a number, but instead you want to talk about it as what's its rank and its suit. And yeah, it's a number, but a complicated one. So yeah, I guess the framework or the meeting advice is deleting it is okay. I don't even know what to do. Sure, deletion approved. There we go. All right, ASCII.equals 84887. Seems like you're expected to call this, Stefan. Is it something you want?
I'm sorry, I was not looking at this ahead of time. How's this different than like span equals? Just verifies that it's ASCII at the same time, or sequence equals rather. So it's like sequence equals plus ASCII validation.
Yeah. If both buffers are equal but contain non-ASCII characters, it returns false. So
Yeah,
ASCII.equals is ASCII and is equal, and then presumably the real value is for equals ignore case.
Mm-hmm. In a lot of cases, for routing, we might still be case sensitive in some cases, but yeah, seems good.
Oh, yeah. And we could get rid of the non-ignore case.
You want to get rid of the non-ignore case?
No, that's what they wrote.
You're right.
That's what they wrote in alternative design of you can call sequence equal and ASCII.is valid. It's like, yep.
Yeah.
I don't know what the right
But this seems convenient.
order is on that one, but all right. So we already have the ASCII class. system text ASCII. What? Is it just too new? Will this be in system runtime ref? Large file warning. Alright. ASCII class.
Yeah, like we'd probably use the ignore case version more, and the equals thing is kind of trivially rewritten, but I would argue for both for consistency, convenience.
Yeah, I mean, looking, everything else on the type overloads across byte and char. So I wonder why this one didn't include ASCII dot equal and equal ignore case of. I mean, I guess we're saying if you have sequence of characters, you can call equal and then call is ASCII. It just seems weird that this will be the first thing to not be paired up. Because everything else is overloaded across those types.
Sorry, say that about the byte and char overloads. You're just saying, I don't sure I followed.
On the existing implementation of the class, or the members that they've already defined, every member has an overload for both byte and char.
This does too?
Did it?
Yeah, and then it even has like the byte and char.
It did. I'm okay. I'm just a dum-dum. And then I think I was looking for, because we have a UTF-8 equals, right? No?
Yeah, I mean, if you have one, it would seem like you would like the other.
Because I was just making sure we called it left and right. So apparently we've never had a member yet called equal ignore case. Then how do we do UTF-8 string comparisons?
There's equals ignore case. Quite a few APIs. I don't see it on UTF-8 right now.
Well, in the catalog here, unless Emo's catalog is corrupt, it says the only method called equals ignore case is in Java lang.
Yeah, I'm also seeing it in configuration manager, which is like the old one in system configuration. I'm using source.net, but
That's private.
oh, is it? Yeah.
Okay, well, as YouTube chat has pointed out, we've kind of severely lost quorum. So, I think
Not enough to approve this. That's fine
yeah.
for now. it's certainly like it kind of makes sense we do ASCII first, in that when we're doing kind of these key comparisons or route comparisons, we're often limited to those characters.
Yeah, in general, I think
in
it's
ASP.NET.
fine. I thought we had this functionality for UTF-8 somewhere as well, and I just want to make sure we're like name aligned on things. And since I can't find it and nobody's here to represent the issue, I think we have to just say we have lost our quorum and get a longer lunchtime.
All right.
So
can use it to prep for the MVP summit anyway. Yeah. Oh wait, we have a hand.
I'm sorry, I was about
okay.
right, not hand.
Fair enough. All right. Well,
Thank you.
thanks to the 3 people who are still with me on the call and the 19 people who are still with us in YouTube chat. But at this point, lacking quorum, we can make no further progress on today's API review, and we will see everyone at our same .NET time, at our same .NET channel. That'll be Thursday, 10 a.m., more like 10:10 Pacific time. See you then.